In recent years, there has been much public discussion in the United States over the teaching of history, from the controversies pertaining to journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones' 1619 project and the debates surrounding Confederate monuments, to the perception amongst some that scholarship on the history of Israel-Palestine is promoting antisemitism. While history is often portrayed as a dry academic subject, the sometimes ill-tempered nature of the public discussion hints at the significance of history to many. Given such sensitivities, this month on Talking History, we will discuss why history can be so controversial and how those tasked with teaching history navigate difficult topics. I'm Patrick Needham.
And I'm Djene Badgelan.
And you're listening to Talking History. So, Djene, welcome as a guest instead of a co-host this time.
Yep, it's a pleasure to be here to be the guest of the week.
So I thought this week we would talk about teaching history and historiography and controversial subjects. In recent years, we've seen lots of lively public debates around the teaching of history in the United States. For example, the 1619 Project, which sought to highlight the centrality of slavery to the history of the United States, provoked a significant controversy, especially among conservatives. Why does history evoke such strong feelings?
Well, I think this points to the fact that history is often very important to our personal identities, to the way that we see ourselves in the world, to the way we locate ourselves within our communities, within the countries we live in. And so when, let's say, for example, certain mythologies, things that we believe are challenged by historians, or at least by some historians, that can be quite a difficult process for people to come to terms with. I mean, I think it's really important to understand one of the reasons history is so central to our identities today is because of the role of history in the process of nation building. So for much of human history, people didn't identify with a particular nation. They might identify with a religious group, a village, maybe a social class, the nobility, the peasantry, etc., etc. But beginning in the 18th century, and especially in the 19th century, we have this new notion of a nation coming into being. And one of the central aspects of building a national identity was getting everybody on the same page regarding history. When we look, for example, at the history of public education, when we think of education today, we often think of education as preparing people for the workforce, that you learn valuable skills that you can then go get a job with. But public education in many countries around the world was not so much implemented for the purpose of educating people for jobs in the workforce, but rather to inculcate with them, in them, a kind of sense of citizenship, a sense of belonging to a national community. So, for example, the historian Eugene Weber wrote a very famous book called Peasants into Frenchmen, which talks about how the education system in France over the course of the 19th century was very important in teaching people the history of France and building a kind of collective national consciousness based on a kind of shared understanding of French language, French history, a sense of national belonging that didn't exist before those kind of big projects of nation building, and the role in which history as part of the curriculum in many public schools was used to kind of shape that concept of a national identity.
So sort of a shared ethos through a shared mythos?
Yeah, so a shared ethos, a shared understanding of the past, of the kind of heroes of the country, of the various phases of that country, a building of a national culture, and that is rooted in a kind of collective identity that is founded upon history and a shared understanding of history. And this means highlighting certain aspects of history as well as downplaying certain aspects of history. For example, the 19th century French scholar Ernest Renan once said, forgetting, I would even say historical error, is an essential factor in the creation of a nation, and it is for this reason that the progress of historical studies often poses a threat to nationality. So Renan was, he was a French nationalist, but he was aware of some of the controversies that history could present to nation builders in the 19th century, that by by kind of presenting history in a particular way, not necessarily falsifying history or lying about history, but emphasizing certain events and individuals in the historical process. That was key to building nationality. But once you get into the details of history, often things are a lot less clear-cut. Things are often a lot more difficult to parse, difficult to understand for people. So history, and when you study history, this can lead to kind of challenges to your mythology about where your nation comes from, who you are as a person. So history can be extremely sensitive topic for many people because it cuts to their identity.
I think what immediately comes to thought is like the Founding Fathers. There is a certain shared mythos around the Founding Fathers, who they were and what their goals and attitudes were. But the more you dig into these people, you find that they were ultimately very, very human and very much the product of a slave-owning society. And the rose-colored glasses come off a bit. Is that a...
Yeah, I think, for example, the American Revolution is a good example of a historical event. And I should note here, I'm speaking a little bit out of my area of expertise, but, all historians should be aware of kind of historical controversies in the broader historical field. The American Revolution is very much a kind of founding myth of the United States. There's a kind of collective, the Founding Fathers are the founders of the nation. And obviously, there is a particular narrative that has been presented over the years, and obviously this has changed from different historical eras, from one historical era to another historical era. So, when we dig into the history of the American Revolution, this kind of good guys versus bad guys version of history becomes a lot more difficult to sustain. So, one of the reasons the 1619 project was so controversial because by placing slavery at the center of the historical narrative of the United States, that challenged many of the kind of mythologies around the United States, around the founding of the United States, around the idea that the United States is an inherently good society, et cetera, et cetera. And this was very sensitive to certain people. That doesn't mean, of course, that the 1619 project is uncontroversial even amongst historians. Now, this project, which was led by the New York Times and by the journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones, elicited, obviously, criticism in the public field. The Trump administration, for example, had a response to it, the 1776 project. But even amongst academic historians, there was a great deal of controversy around this. There were critics of this project who critiqued it from a conservative perspective, as well as those who critiqued it from a left-wing perspective as well. So, for example, a really good example of a public, a historian on the left who critiqued it was Thomas McNamara, who is a Marxist historian who critiqued the 1619 project for replacing class with race as the central organizing principle of American history. So there have been lots of controversies about this topic because not all historians agree.
Sure. And given these sensitivities, both in the public and amongst historians themselves, how do you go about teaching these topics?
Yeah, and I think this speaks to a very important aspect of teaching academic history, which is historiography. A lot of students come into a history degree and they don't quite know what the word historiography means. It's a kind of technical term that historians use, and it can mean a number of different things and depending on the context within which it's being used. So on a meta level, historiography refers to the approaches that people take to history. What are the ideological lenses through which people look at the historical process? You have conservative historians, liberal historians, Marxist historians, postmodernist historians, all of who have different approaches, different ideological approaches to looking at the historical process. It can also refer to the type of history you're doing. Are you doing economic history? Are you doing cultural history? Are you doing political history? Are you doing the history of religion? Again, it can refer to the kind of field that you're looking in. And how you look at a historical topic is going to depend on what lens you're looking at that topic. It could also refer to the type of sources that people use. In my field in Middle Eastern history, before the 1990s, a lot of studies on Middle Eastern history were written using primarily European sources to reconstruct the history of the Middle East. And that obviously has issues with it because, of course, you're looking at the historical process through primary sources. But those primary sources have their own biases and agendas that you have to take into account. It's not to say that other sources don't. For example, sources written in Middle Eastern languages, whether that's Arabic or Turkish or Persian or Kurdish, all these different languages, they too have their own biases. So, a kind of corrective to the to historical writing is often shaped by the types of sources you use as well as the approach you have to a particular topic. And then historiography can have a much more limited meaning in the sense of the historiography of a particular topic. So, for example, when we talk about the historiography of the American Revolution, we're talking about how different historians have written about this topic, what kind of sources did they use in these topics, what kind of ideological perspectives did they bring to this topic. Very often you'll hear people say, well, we have to teach unbiased history. But that's just simply not possible because nobody lives outside of society. Everybody comes to writing history with their own perspectives, with their own biases, with their own sort of ideological agendas. And what a good historian will do is they will recognize that they might have those agendas and those ideas, but try and be as honest and fair to, for example, historians they disagree with and explain why they disagree with those historians. And this will be the kind of debate. So there's no definitive kind of picture of history that historians have. There's no objectively correct or incorrect version of history. There are just examples of historical writing that are better in terms of being better researched, being more honest with the sources, and those which are perhaps, let's say, misinterpreting sources, etc., etc. So we'll often have a lot of a lot of debate amongst historians, and this ongoing debate is how the field gets pushed forwards. Everybody who does a PhD in history has to contribute to our overall knowledge of history. And the way that you frame your historical research is by talking about where does it fit in with the historiography of the topic? What are you criticizing? What are you trying to prove? What are you trying to demonstrate? So everybody who writes a PhD in some way is trying to challenge the existing historical record or fill out the existing historical record in a new way by trying to look at a topic in a new way, perhaps using a new theoretical understanding of, let's say, psychology. A good example is psychology, for example, with the development of psychology as a field. Some historians took ideas developed in the field of psychology and applied them to history to see if they were to try and create a narrative of history that's based on psychological insights drawn from the field of psychology. The same with, let's say, sociology or political science. You'll have historians perhaps drawing on different insights from those fields to provide a new narrative or to shed light on a particular topic in history. A good example might be, let's say, the history of labor in the United States. This was, let's say, a topic that was not looked at in a lot of detail until like the 1950s and 1960s. And suddenly you have this field of labor studies that starts looking at, the impact of organized labor on American history and the American experiment. So when you're teaching history, whatever class you're teaching in history, one of the things that good history teachers do is less about kind of telling them what is right and what is wrong in terms of what happened in the historical process, but introducing students to the writings of different historians to talk about, well, why do these historians, let's say, disagree on let's say, the causes of the First World War. Some might focus on the rivalries between different nations over colonial empires. Some might focus on, let's say, militarism as being the cause for the First World War. And a good history teacher exposes their students to those different arguments, talks about why those historians have those perspectives they do, how did they come to those conclusions, what kind of sources did they use to build their argument out, how later historians have critiqued those ideas. And so when teaching controversial topics, the point is not to let's necessarily be an iconoclast, although historians in a certain way always act as iconoclasts because, we end up challenging people's perceptions about the past, but to introduce them to the writings of scholars who have done research on these topics and to talk about how and why they differ, which arguments are stronger, which arguments are weaker. And of course, this feeds into present day politics as well, because a lot of historical topics do have relevance today in the way that we understand the world, the way that we kind of think about the world, and the way that we situate ourselves in the kind of broader historical process. What tradition are we kind of living in? What kind of tradition are we supporting?
And this is maybe flipping the script a little bit, but I guess I am the lay person on this show, and so I'm interested in how lay people interpret history. How can you mentioned there not being really a way to teach history that is unbiased. I mean, you're seeing you have bias both like in the historian who is making the writings, but that historian is also going through texts, primary and secondary sources, which all contain their own biases. Mm-hmm. So how do I, as an amateur reader of history, suss out the biases and motivations of these authors and find as we said, there's no objective truth, but find that truest interpretation, I guess?
I mean, that is a very difficult question because a lot of the time, sometimes historians aren't necessarily disagreeing on the facts, but they might have different opinions on what is good and what is bad for the society. So you might have a libertarian historian and a liberal historian disagreeing on, agreeing about the facts of, let's say, the New Deal, but disagreeing on whether it was a positive or negative development. And they will present different arguments for their particular position. And it's up to people themselves to look at these sources and think about, which one they agree with, right? If you don't think state intervention is a good thing on principle, you're not going to view the New Deal as being a good thing on principle. If you think state intervention can be a good thing in principle, then you might have a more positive view. So it is very difficult to disentangle present-day political concerns, this concept of presentism, from studying history, because we all come to these topics with our own sort of points of views and biases. And we all have this sometimes we have this tendency for confirmation bias, where we will kind of look at things that support our arguments and kind of dismiss things that challenge our positions. I mean, there's a very famous, he's an English professor, an individual known as Grover Furr, who, although an English professor, has written extensively on Stalin and the Soviet Union. And, he's a big defender of Stalin, says Stalin did nothing wrong. And he's an interesting example of someone in academia that it's worth reading, because it's an example, for example, of not how to do history, where he'll say something like, well, I didn't find any evidence of this, but this lack of evidence means that it was obviously destroyed, and my argument is still correct, and none of this happened. So you can see sometimes when people come across sources that don't necessarily support their point of view or don't even exist, then that is a good thing to discuss. What are they basing this opinion on? A really good example of both how historians disagree on topics, as well as how historiography and historical debates often feed into modern politics is, the discussion we have today over the history of Ukraine and the Holodomor, which was the mass famine that took place under Stalin in the Soviet Union. And within the context of the war in Ukraine, many people look to scholarship that made the case that this mass starvation was a deliberate policy of Stalin directed at the Ukrainian people, directed at killing large numbers of Ukrainian people in order to promote great Russian nationalism. But this kind of points to a kind of deep debate that took place in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s about Soviet history. So, for example, in writing about the famine in the Ukraine, you have the historian Robert Conquest, who wrote a very famous book called The Harvest of Sorrow, which made the case that this was a genocide, right? Said intentional genocide. Now, this led to a very mean-spirited debate within history journals, especially with the historian John Getty, who questioned whether the starvation in the Ukraine was a genocide. But interestingly enough, this was not really a debate about the human cost of that famine. Both scholars agreed that this was a man-made famine. Mm-hmm. It was a famine exacerbated by Soviet policies. But where they disagreed was the question of intention. Mm-hmm. So Getty made the case, well, yes, this was a horrific thing, but the objective was not the destruction of the Ukrainian people, but rather this was a manifestation of the mismanagement of the Soviet economy. So there was no deliberate policy directed at killing large numbers of Ukrainians, but rather large numbers of Ukrainians died because of mismanagement. Whereas Conquest made the case, no, this was a deliberate policy. And this talks to how historians use sources. A lot of sources that Conquest relied on were those of emigres, people who had fled the Soviet Union, who, while no doubt describing real historical events, would obviously spin that in a particular way. Ukrainian nationalists who fled the Soviet Union both before and after the Second World War, wanted to present this Soviet policy as being one directed at wiping out the Ukrainians, whereas Getty, who relied more on statistics and other archival sources, made the case that actually there isn't evidence to say that this was a deliberate policy, but rather just an outcome of this mismanagement. So this is a good example of historical debates. Of course, within the context of today's war in Ukraine, many people who, for example, might question whether this famine in the Ukraine was a genocide are accused of, let's say, supporting Russia because they don't buy into the particular narrative that the Soviet Union was attempting to wipe out the Ukrainian nation.
Is that in part because the Holodomor has become a part of the Ukrainian national mythos?
Yeah, because it is a key point in the Ukrainian national mythos that Ukraine was repressed during the Soviet Union period, and that the Russians wanted to wipe out the Ukrainians, and this is a kind of element of continuity that goes back to the Tsarist era when the Tsar also attempted to wipe out the Ukrainian nationality as a kind of separate group. So yeah, because this particular famine is critical to Ukrainian national identity, supporters of Ukraine will often kind of buy into that narrative when within the field of history, this is kind of a controversial topic.
It's still unsettled,
and I think
considered. I mean,
it's still debated amongst historians. I would say probably what they call the revisionist perspective is the dominant one, but there is never, within any historical field, you will find there is a range of opinions, and many of those opinions, even if they disagree, are well-founded on documentary and historical evidence.
So let's change gears here and talk about the Middle East, your area of expertise. There's obviously no real shortage of controversy when teaching Middle Eastern history. I mean, even just recent Middle Eastern history and the United States' involvement in it, I'm sure leads to some complicated conversations. But specifically now, probably the most fraught topic would be Israel and Palestine. How do you approach teaching something as controversial as the Israel-Palestine conflict in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a question I think everybody who, teaches Middle Eastern history has to wrestle with, because it is a controversial topic. It is a topic that has implications today. The Israel-Palestine conflict is still ongoing. And a lot of people are invested in the various historical narratives regarding the Israel-Palestine question. So my job as someone who teaches history is that I don't want to impose a particular perspective on people, but rather I want to expose them to what historians have written about that particular topic. And there is a rich tradition amongst both Western historians as well as both Israeli and Palestinian historians, many of whom have been trained in the West, discussing the origins and development of the Israel-Palestine question. And one way I like to approach this particular question is to look at those different narratives, to look at how they came into being, why different groups view things in different ways. So, for example, from the Israeli perspective, the Holy Land, Israel, has a deep spiritual and religious connection to the Jewish people. Prior to the modern era, there's this notion, biblical notion found in Deuteronomy, talking about the gathering in Israel. This was a kind of religious idea. And in the 19th and early 20th century, on top of this kind of religious idea, we have this notion of Zionism. And Zionism, in its modern iteration, is the notion that the Jewish people constitute a nation, that they are a distinct ethnic and national community, and that as a distinct ethnic and national community, they have the right to national self-determination, the right to have a nation state of their own. And for obvious historical reasons, where the Jewish people should have that nation state was the historical land of Israel, where, of course, there's the history of the Jewish kingdoms that existed there in ancient times. There's deep spiritual connection to those ideas. And then, of course, this religious idea amongst the Jewish diaspora that, at the end of time, Jews will return to Israel. And in the 19th century, this kind of mutated, if that's the right word, was added on by the ideology of nationalism. And we see within the Jewish community, especially in Europe at the time, some Jewish people sought to assimilate into the national communities they lived in. So one of the big movements during the 19th century was the emancipation of Jewish people. Jewish people no longer being ghettoized and kind of separated from society, and the integration of Jewish people into politics and society in Western Europe. But of course, there was still, tremendous anti-Semitism. So you have some Jewish people reacting against this anti-Semitism in Europe, saying, well, the Europeans don't accept us as part of their nation. I'm, born in France, but yet I'm still not viewed as equal to a French person. And many of those people became attracted to the idea of Zionism, that Jewish people had to, for their own protection, create their own nation state. And when they looked around for where they would do this, the answer seemed self-evident, that, well, historically, Jews are from this kingdom, from this territory in the Middle East, and this is where we should go and live and set up our nation state. So there's a kind of assumption here born out of history, born out of experience, that leads many Jewish people to become Zionists, that is, the supporters of a Jewish state and the creation of a Jewish state in the historical land of Israel. And we need to understand why people came to see that in this way. And then, of course, you have the Palestinian narrative, which I want to expose people to as well, because for the Palestinians, for the Christian and the Muslim population who lived in Palestine before the creation of the State of Israel, these Jewish people who were coming from Europe and from Russia and then later on from other parts of the Middle East were seen as, quote-unquote, colonizing that region as well. And for many Palestinians, for many Arabs, this was seen as violating their right of self-determination. So when, for example, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, many Christians and Muslims in Palestine wanted to be part of an independent Arab state, and they opposed the establishment of a Jewish state on a territory which they saw as being their territory, a land where their ancestors had also lived as well. So you have these two competing narratives of history, which, as someone trying to teach and understand the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think it's important to understand both those narratives as well. Whatever side of the political debate you're on, it's important to understand why people think the way that they do. Why do Palestinians feel the way that they do? Why do Israelis feel the way that they do? And I think teaching the different historical narratives pertaining to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how Palestinian historians have written on it, how Israeli historians have written on it, is very important to understanding the nature of that conflict.
So that's unfortunately where we're going to have to end this week. But my takeaway is read everything and question all of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, even if there's a historical perspective that you might have a visceral reaction to, that you might think this must be wrong, it's worth reading, worth trying to understand and get into the mindset of people who believe differently from you. And reading different perspectives on history is really important for that.
Well, thank you, Djene. This has been Talking History from the Missouri State University History Department and KSMU. You can catch us the first Thursday of every month on KSMU or at ksmu.org or wherever you find your podcasts.